Born in 1809, Abraham Lincoln was brought up in a small farmhouse in Kentucky. Personal turmoil enveloped his life from a very young age, beginning when his mother Nancy died in 1818. Abraham was only 9 years old. 9 years after that, his sister died as well. These depressing events pushed him to grow up very fast, teaching him how to go on in times of tragedy. Lincoln was described as gaunt, self-doubtful, humorous, emotionally strong, and able to hide his emotions, a trait that a leader needs in troublesome situations. He was honorable and tried to always keep his word. In 1840, Lincoln married Mary Todd, a woman from a very wealthy background. Lincoln joined the Republican Party in the 1850s, a party that usually leaned anti-slavery. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the 16th President of the United States, and shortly after, the Civil War erupted. Lincoln is known as the Great Emancipator, but what did he really believe about slavery? Before his presidential office, his position on slavery pleased no one. He wasn't for or against it, but wanted to avoid the topic. He wanted slavery to simply fade away. Because of this, Lincoln can be described as a gradualist. During his presidential campaign, he must have realized that an abolitionist would never win office because of the extreme racism in both the North and the South. Besides, Lincoln wasn't an abolitionist anyway. Lincoln justified the war as necessary to keep the United States together as one nation, to reunite the Union and the Confederacy. However, as the war went on, the abolition of slavery was added to the Civil War purpose. Lincoln did, however, oppose the spread of slavery. He was deeply angered by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, an act where the Utah and New Mexico territories could choose if they wanted to have slaves. This is the yellow area on the map. At one point during his presidency, some sources say that Lincoln wanted to remove African American presence from the United States by deporting both slaves and freedmen back to Africa. If this was true, he certainly never acted upon it. In a letter to Horace Greeley, a newspaper editor in New York, Lincoln states, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps the Union." This showed that he valued a Union victory over the abolition of slavery. What about the Emancipation Proclamation? The problem with this famous document is that since the Confederacy considered itself a whole separate nation divided from the North, all federal decisions and laws didn't apply to them. The Confederacy had its own government and president by that time and didn't affiliate with anything from the Union. Slave states that were a part of the Union didn't abolish slavery either, as the Emancipation Proclamation only regarded those rebelling states that had seceded. What it did do was undermine the economy and military of the South and yell to the world that slavery would eventually be abolished when the Confederacy had completely fallen. You see, if Lincoln freed the slaves, or acted like he was going to free the slaves, then Britain would be less inclined to join the South in the war, who depended on the South's cotton. In this way, the Emancipation Proclamation acted as a sham to keep Britain from interfering with the American Civil War. Lincoln wanted the war to be ended quickly, and as his abolitionist advisors told him, the war would be over sooner if slavery was abolished. Lincoln didn't like slavery, but he didn't necessarily like African Americans either. In a presidential debate, Lincoln announces, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people, and I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be a position of superior and inferior, and as much as any other man am I in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." This statement shows that he may approve the abolition of slavery, but he does not view African Americans as equals, or even as men, and would therefore not grant them equal rights. By replacing George McClellan with Ulysses S. Grant, a more aggressive and tenacious general, Lincoln's intentions for the South were clear. He wanted to crush the Confederacy with an iron fist. More Americans died in the Civil War than in all other wars combined, around 500,000 troops. This war also included massive destruction of property, especially in the South. The Union, encouraged by President Lincoln, looted, raped, and executed without trial or charge of noncombatants. If tried in the Normandy World War II trials by the laws established by the Allies, Lincoln and all of his high-ranking generals would unquestionably be qualified as war criminals. General William Tecumseh Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864 remains the worst act of terrorism committed by an American on American soil. This march began on November 15, 1864, South Carolina and Georgia being the main targets. In front of the General Army, scouts and their followers stripped homes, barns, and fields, burning everything they couldn't use. General Sherman seemed to think that the horrible destruction would break the South's will to continue the war. Both the Union and the Confederates struggled to observe the rules and conventions of the war, specifically the treatment of prisoners by unlawfully executing or torturing those captured. By allowing African Americans to serve for the Union in 1863, slaves that could fled their plantations, thirsty for freedom. 180,000 African Americans served in the Army, 30,000 served in the Navy, half of these from the seceded states. On a much lower scale of felon activity, the Union illegally arrested Confederate supporters in the North and the legislators who they believed would vote to have Maryland join the Confederacy. You may be wondering, well, why don't most people know this? Most people don't know Lincoln's story, just what they learned in grade school, about a great leader who stood up for what he believed was right in a time where many didn't. The truth is, the American government twists every story to look a little better in the eyes of its citizens. After all, who would want to live in a place and follow a government where we view ourselves as a horrible people? During the American Revolution, Britain probably viewed the American colonies similarly to how we now view Al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups, but most aren't taught that view in school. Lincoln lived in frontier towns for most of his life, so concrete evidence of his comings and goings is hard, if not impossible, to find. After Lincoln's assassination by John Wilkes Booth at Ford Theater on April 14, 1865, a man named William Herndon gathered people that knew Lincoln to write a biography, but many hadn't seen Lincoln in decades. Much of the information that was shared was dismissed as gossip. The Confederacy's Secretary of State burned all of their records when Federal troops entered Richmond, Virginia towards the end of the war. In general, there was a huge lack of records, access to those records, and the questionable truth of those records that were kept during the Civil War. But if you dig deep enough, not all of real history is buried. Nobody is perfect, especially politicians. But a lot of what President Abraham Lincoln did for our nation was great. Even though slavery did not legally end until after his death, he still put the idea into federal motion. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, gave African Americans equal protection under law and the right to hold political office. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, gave African Americans the right to vote. Through all of the hardships that African Americans have faced, it is truly a great achievement to have an African American president this year, Barack Obama. In conclusion, former President Abraham Lincoln valued the superiority of the federal Union government and the power of white men over the abolition of slavery. In our time period, Lincoln would be considered a racist, undoubtedly, but we must consider the time period in which he lived. People in the 1800s doubted racial equality from ever occurring, and so perhaps it is unfair to say that Lincoln was racist. Whether or not his true intentions and beliefs were well-meant or hostile, he did a great number of things for the United States of America that we must still thank him for.